The general's voice cut through the ceremony like a blade. "Where did you get that?" Every conversation around us stopped. Boots froze mid-step on the polished floor. I felt a dozen eyes land on my hand, the one I hadn't thought twice about that morning. The one wearing my grandfather's ring. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the weight of it. It was my grandfather's, sir. The general didn't blink. His face had gone pale in a way I had only ever seen once before in a combat zone when something went very, very wrong. "What was his name?" he asked quietly. I told him. And just like that, the room shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. Like the air itself had tightened. The general straightened to his full height. "You'll report to my office after this," he said. Then, softer almost to himself, I thought he was gone without anyone left. I stood there in my dress blues, heart pounding, wondering how a man my own family barely showed up to bury could make a general react like that. 3 days earlier, I had stood in a very different kind of silence. The cemetery sat on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, tucked behind a row of aging oak trees that hadn't quite leafed out yet. It was the kind of place people forgot about until they needed it. Quiet, modest, honest. There were no crowds, no long line of cars, just me. I remember looking over my shoulder one last time before the service began, half expecting, half hoping to see my parents' car pulling in late. My mother had always been late. My father would have complained about the drive, but he would have come. But the road stayed empty. The funeral director cleared his throat gently. "We can begin whenever you're ready." I nodded, though I didn't feel ready. I don't think anyone ever is not really. The casket was simple. My grandfather wouldn't have wanted anything fancy. He had never been that kind of man. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, fixed things instead of replacing them, and wore the same jackets year after year until the fabric softened with age. To my family, he had been background noise, a responsibility, something to manage. To me, he had been the only one who ever listened. "I'm sorry, it's just me," I said quietly, stepping closer to the casket. I wasn't even sure who I was apologizing to, him or myself. The minister read a few words. Standard, respectful, but impersonal. He didn't know my grandfather. There hadn't been much to tell. No one had offered him stories. No one had even tried. When it was time, I stepped forward alone. "I guess I'm the one who talks now," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You never really liked attention anyway." The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above us. For a second, it almost felt like an answer. I took a breath. "He fixed my bike when I was 10, I said. Didn't say much while he did it, just showed me how to hold the wrench, told me to watch closely." I smiled faintly. I didn't understand then, but "I think you were teaching me more than just how to fix a chain." I paused, glancing again at the empty rows of chairs behind me. "They should have been here," I said, softer now. "You deserved that." The words hung there heavier than I expected. But there was no one to argue with me, no one to defend their absence. Just silence. When the service ended, the workers moved forward to lower the casket. I stood there, hands at my sides, until it disappeared from view. And then I realized something that hit harder than I was ready for. I was the only one left to remember him. His house still smelled like him. Old wood, coffee, a faint trace of engine oil that never quite washed out of his hands, no matter how many times he scrubbed them. I let myself in with the spare key he'd hidden under the same loose brick for as long as I could remember. He used to joke that if someone really wanted to break in, a key wouldn't stop them anyway. "Better to trust people until they give you a reason not to," he'd said once. I wasn't sure my parents had ever agreed with that. The place was quiet, too quiet. I moved through it, slowly touching things without really thinking. The back of a chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the old radio he kept by the window. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. Like he might walk back in at any moment. But he wouldn't. I opened the small wooden box on his dresser almost without thinking. I had seen it 100 times, but he'd never made a big deal about what was inside. It wasn't locked. Inside were a few photographs, a folded flag, and the ring. I picked it up carefully. It wasn't flashy, no bright stones or polished shine, just a solid band worn smooth in places with markings I didn't recognize etched along the side. It didn't look like anything special, at least not to anyone who didn't know better. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the weight of it. "Guess this is coming with me," I murmured. There wasn't anyone else who would take it. I called my parents that night. They didn't even send flowers, I said, pacing the small living room. Not even a card. My mother sighed on the other end. We talked about this. Your father has work, and it's a long drive. He raised you, I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. He deserved more than an excuse. There was a pause. Well, she said finally, he wasn't exactly easy either. I closed my eyes. That was how they justified it. Always had been. He was quiet, distant, not expressive enough. So they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. He wasn't what you think, I said. You didn't really know him, she replied. Neither did you, I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I looked down at the ring now sitting on my coffee table. I'm going back to base tomorrow, I said. Already, she asked. Yeah. Another pause. Well, drive safe. That was it. No mention of the funeral, no second thoughts. Just done. The morning I left, I slipped the ring onto my finger without thinking too much about it. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough. I adjusted it once, then let my hand fall to my side. I didn't know why I was keeping it. Maybe because it was the only thing no one else had claimed. Maybe because it felt wrong to leave it behind. Or maybe because deep down I knew it mattered. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. The general's question stayed with me long after the ceremony ended. Where did you get that? It echoed in my mind as I stood outside the hall at Marine Corps Base Quantico, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Marines moved past me in quiet clusters, their voices low, respectful. No one lingered too long. Except me. I kept my hand at my side, but I could feel the ring like it had its own pulse. Heavy, warmer than it should have been. I turned it slowly with my thumb. Same worn edges, same faint markings I still couldn't quite make out. And yet somehow, not the same. The drive back to base housing had been uneventful, but my thoughts weren't. I hadn't expected anything to come from wearing it. Truth is, I hadn't even thought much about it at all when I slipped it on that morning. It had just felt right. Now I wasn't so sure. The general's reaction wasn't confusion, it wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. That unsettled me more than anything. Later that evening, I sat alone at my small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is quiet. And everything felt very quiet. I pulled the ring off my finger and set it in the center of the table. For a long time, I just stared at it. "What are you?" I murmured. The markings along the side caught the light differently now. I leaned in closer, narrowing my eyes. They weren't decorative. They looked deliberate. Like they meant something. I reached for my phone and snapped a picture, zooming in on the engraving. Still nothing I recognized. No initials, no dates, no obvious insignia. Just lines, patterns, codes maybe. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My grandfather had never worn anything flashy. Not watches, not jewelry, not even a proper suit most days. And yet he'd kept this. Worn it enough to smooth the edges. Kept it close. Why? I thought about calling my parents again. Then I thought better of it. They'd already made it clear how much or how little this meant to them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. So I did the next best thing. I opened my laptop. An hour later, I had more questions than answers. I tried every combination I could think of: military rings, special forces, insignia, custom engravings. I even pulled up images of United States Navy SEALs rings, comparing shapes and designs. Nothing matched. Most of what I found online was ceremonial. Graduation rings, unit rings, recognizable, documented. This wasn't that. This was something else. I closed the laptop with a soft click. "Of course you didn't make it easy," I muttered. That sounded like him. I remembered something then. The wooden box. It was still sitting in my duffel bag, tucked beneath a folded uniform. I'd packed it almost without thinking when I left his house, along with a few photographs and that folded flag. I pulled it out now and set it on the table. Same worn wood, same simple latch. I opened it carefully. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The photographs first. I picked one up. It was old edges, slightly curled. My grandfather stood beside a truck I didn't recognize, younger than I'd ever seen him. His expression was the same, though calm, unreadable. There was someone else in the background, half out of frame. I frowned, bringing it closer. The face wasn't clear, but the posture, the stance, it felt familiar somehow. Military, maybe. I set the photo aside and reached for the folded flag. It was neatly pressed triangle crisp, the fabric still carrying that faint scent of storage and time. I held it for a moment, then placed it gently back. That left one thing. A small envelope I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was plain, no stamp, no address. Just one word written across the front in careful, steady handwriting. Keep. I felt my throat tighten. He'd meant for someone to find this. For me to find it. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. And a second smaller object wrapped in tissue. I unfolded the paper first. The handwriting was the same as the envelope. Simple, direct. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain things the right way. I swallowed my eyes, moving slowly across the page. There are parts of my life I chose not to share. Not because I didn't trust you, but because some things are better carried quietly. That sounded exactly like him. The ring isn't just a keepsake, it's a key. Not one you use on a door, but one that opens conversations most people will never have. My hand tightened slightly around the paper. A man may recognize it, if he does listen to him, and don't let anyone else decide what it means. I exhaled slowly. So the general hadn't just noticed it. He'd known it. I looked at the last line. You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family. I set the letter down, my mind racing. Then I reached for the small object wrapped in tissue. Carefully, I unwrapped it. Inside was a second ring. This one different. Less worn, sharper edges, a darker finish. And on its face, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, was a symbol. I leaned closer. It wasn't something I recognized from any official insignia. But it carried weight. Authority. Finality. I sat back, both rings now in front of me. My grandfather hadn't just left me a memory. He'd left me something unfinished. The next morning I stood outside the administrative building, both rings in my pocket. The general had told me to report. And now I understood why. I adjusted my uniform, taking a steady breath. I wasn't sure what I was about to walk into. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Not confusion. Not grief. Something steadier. Purpose, maybe. I stepped forward and opened the door. The door closed softly behind me, but the sound carried. It always does in buildings like that, old walls, high ceilings, everything echoing just a little longer than you expect. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, taking in the quiet order of the place. Framed commendations lined the hallway. Names, dates, operations I recognized and others I didn't. The kind of history that never makes it into headlines but shapes everything underneath. A young lieutenant sat behind a desk near the end of the corridor. He looked up as I approached. "Ma'am," he said, standing, "the general is expecting you." I nodded. "Thank you." He gestured toward a closed door. No nameplate, just a small brass number. That felt intentional. I walked down the hallway, each step measured, not rushed, not hesitant. Just steady. The way I'd been trained. "Enter." The voice came before I knocked. I paused, then pushed the door open. The office was simple. Larger than most, but not extravagant. A desk, a couple of chairs, a bookshelf with neatly arranged binders, and a few framed photographs turned just slightly away from the door. The general stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn right away. "Close the door," he said. I did. Only then did he face me. Up close, the lines on his face were more visible. Not just age experience, the kind that settles in after decades of decisions most people never have to make. "At ease," he said. I relaxed my posture slightly. His eyes dropped to my hand. "The ring," he said. I slipped it off and held it out. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he studied it from a distance, like he already knew what he would see but needed to confirm it. Finally, he stepped forward and took it carefully, turning it between his fingers. "Where did you say you got this?" "My grandfather, sir." "And his name?" I told him again. This time he closed his eyes briefly. Not long. Just enough. I served with a man who spoke about him once, he said quietly. Didn't use his real name. None of them did. But the description... He shook his head slightly. It matches. I felt something tighten in my chest. What kind of description? I asked. He looked up at me. The kind you don't forget. He set the ring down on his desk and walked around it slowly as if organizing his thoughts. Your grandfather, he began, was part of something that doesn't officially exist. I didn't respond. You don't interrupt a general, and you don't interrupt when someone is about to change your understanding of everything. They operated alongside units like the United States Navy SEALs, he continued, but they weren't listed under any command you could find in a public record. Black operations? I asked carefully. He gave a slight nod. Deeper than that. The room felt smaller all of a sudden. He was known for two things, the general went on: precision and silence. That didn't surprise me. It fit. He completed missions most teams wouldn't even attempt, he said. And when he came back, he didn't talk about them. Not to his superiors, not to his peers, certainly not to his family. A faint, almost sad smile touched his face. Men like that don't need recognition. They carry their own. I looked down at the ring on his desk. And this? I asked. He picked it up again. This, he said, isn't a decoration, it's a marker. A marker for what? For those who know, he replied simply. That didn't feel like enough of an answer. But it felt like the only one I was going to get. I reached into my pocket. There's something else, I said. His eyes sharpened. I placed the second ring on the desk beside the first. For the first time since I'd walked in, he looked unsettled. He didn't touch it right away. Where did you find that? He asked. In a box he left behind, with a letter. The general stared at the second ring for a long moment before finally picking it up. His hand was steady, but his expression wasn't. I haven't seen one of these in a long time, he said. What is it? He exhaled slowly. Authority. I frowned. That's not very specific, sir. It's not meant to be, he replied. He set both rings down side by side. The first ring tells people your grandfather belonged, he said. The second, he paused, the second tells them he mattered. I let that sink in. All those years, I said quietly, and no one knew. The general's gaze shifted to me. Are you sure about that? I thought of my parents. The empty chairs at the funeral. The excuses. If they did, I said, they didn't act like it. He nodded once as if he understood more than I had said. Sometimes people choose not to see what's in front of them, he said. It's easier that way. He moved back toward the window, looking out across the base. I was a young officer when I first heard his name, he said. Not from a report, from another man who owed him his life. I stayed silent. He said your grandfather walked into a situation that was already lost, the general continued. No backup, no guarantee he'd make it out. What happened? I asked. The general's reflection in the glass didn't move. He made sure everyone else did. A quiet settled over the room. And him? I asked. The general finally turned. He always did. I felt a strange mix of pride and something heavier. Regret, maybe. Not mine. Theirs. My family didn't even come to his funeral, I said before I could stop myself. The words hung there. The general didn't react right away. When he did, his voice was calm. Then that's something they'll have to live with. He stepped back toward the desk and slid the rings toward me. Keep them, he said. I wasn't planning on giving them up. A faint hint of approval crossed his face. Good. I picked them up, closing my hand around both. They mean something now, I said. They always did, he corrected gently. You just didn't have the context. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I was dismissed. The general seemed to read it. There's one more thing, he said. I waited. If anyone else asks about those rings, he said you don't owe them an explanation. I thought of the letter. You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family. I nodded slowly. Yes, sir. When I stepped back out into the hallway, everything looked the same. Same walls, same framed history. But I didn't feel the same. I reached into my pocket and felt the rings again. Not just metal anymore. Not just something left behind. Something earned. Something carried forward. And for the first time since I'd stood alone at that grave, I didn't feel like I was the only one remembering him. I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, the late light fading across the windshield, both rings resting in my palm. The bass moved around me in its usual rhythm, vehicles passing, boots on pavement, distant voices carrying and fading, but it all felt slightly removed, like I was watching it from just outside myself. All those years I murmured, closing my fingers around the metal, and you never said a word. That sounded like him. Quiet, steady, never explaining more than he had to. I leaned back in the seat and let out a slow breath. The general's words kept circling in my head. He belonged, he mattered. I had spent most of my life thinking my grandfather had been overlooked. Now I was starting to understand he had been something else entirely. That night I spread everything out on my kitchen table. The wooden box, the photographs, the folded flag, the letter, the 2 rings. I turned the second ring under the light again, studying the symbol etched into its face. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to be recognized. But only by the right people. I reached for the photographs next. There were only a handful. My grandfather had never been one to collect memories on paper, but now that I looked closer, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. He was never the center of the frame. Always slightly off to the side. Partially turned away, as if he had made sure he couldn't be easily identified. I picked up the photo of him by the truck again. This time I focused on the figure in the background. Same posture, same stance I had noticed before. Military. But not standard. There was something about the way he held himself, alert but controlled, not rigid, not casual. Trained. I set the photo down slowly. You weren't just quiet, I said under my breath, you were careful. The letter lay where I had left it, the words still fresh in my mind. If a man recognizes the ring, listen to him. I had. And now I knew more than I ever had before. But it raised a different question. Why leave it to me? Why not tell someone sooner? I sat back staring at the ceiling for a moment. Maybe he had tried. Maybe no one had listened. The next day I called home again. This time my father answered. Hey, he said, his tone neutral. You back at base? Yeah. A pause. How was the service, he asked. The question landed heavier than I expected. You really want to know, I replied. Another pause. Look, he said, clearing his throat. We already talked about why we couldn't make it. I wasn't asking about that, I said. I was asking if you wanted to know how it felt. Silence. Then quietly, go ahead. I took a breath. It felt empty, I said, because it was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stood there by myself, I continued, said goodbye by myself, watched them lower him into the ground by myself. My grip tightened on the edge of the table. And I kept waiting for you to show up. He didn't respond. I kept thinking maybe you'd walk in late, I said. Make a comment about traffic, or the weather, something. Still nothing. But you didn't. I let the silence sit there this time. Finally he spoke. He wasn't easy, he said. You know that. I closed my eyes. That's not an answer. It's the truth, he replied a little more firmly now. He didn't talk. He didn't share. Half the time it felt like he didn't even want us around. I looked down at the rings in front of me. You ever think there might have been a reason for that, I asked. What kind of reason, he said. I hesitated. The general's voice echoed in my mind. You don't owe anyone an explanation. But this wasn't about owing. This was about understanding. Do you know what he did before he retired, I asked. He worked on engines, my father said without hesitation. You've seen the garage. No, I said quietly, before that. Another pause. He never said, my father admitted. Did you ever ask? A longer silence this time. I figured if he wanted us to know, he would have told us. I let out a slow breath. He was part of something you wouldn't understand, I said finally. That got his attention. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, that he wasn't just some quiet old man fixing things in his garage. I could hear the shift on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? He asked. I'm talking about the fact that a general recognized something he left behind, I said, and reacted like it mattered. My father didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was different. Recognized what? I looked down at the ring. This, I said. We agreed to meet. Not right away. Schedules, distance, life, it all still existed. But there was something else there now. curiosity, maybe even a little regret. After the call, I sat there for a long time. I hadn't told him everything. Not about the second ring. Not about the letter. Not about the look on the general's face. That felt earned. Something my grandfather had chosen to pass down. Something I wasn't ready to hand over yet. I picked up the first ring again, sliding it back onto my finger. It settled into place like it belonged there. Then I picked up the second one and held it for a moment before placing it back in the box. Not hidden. Just protected. For now, I said softly. Later that evening, I stepped outside. The air was cooler, the sky just starting to darken. Lights flickered on across the base, one by one, steady and predictable. I thought about the man I had buried. The man my family thought they knew. The man I was only just beginning to understand. "You really didn't make this easy," I said with a faint, tired smile. But maybe that had been the point. Not everything worth knowing comes easy. Some things have to be earned. And now for the first time I felt like I was standing at the beginning of something. Not the end. I met my parents the following Saturday at a diner off Route 40, the kind of place that had been there longer than most of the strip around it. Brown vinyl booths, coffee that never quite stopped pouring, waitresses who called everyone Han whether they knew you or not. It was neutral ground. I didn't want to do this in their house where everything turned into old patterns before anyone noticed, and I didn't want to do it at my grandfather's place where the walls still felt like they belonged to him. My mother was already seated when I walked in. My father stood near the register, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had agreed to something before he had fully decided whether he wanted to be there. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. No hugs, no easy smiles. That was fine. I slid into the booth across from them and set the wooden box on the table between the sugar caddy and the napkin dispenser. My mother looked at it first. "What's that?" she asked. "Something Grandpa left behind," I said. A waitress came over, poured coffee, asked if we needed time with the menus. None of us had opened them. "We're fine," my father said. When she walked away, the quiet returned. I rested my hand on the box. I met with the general after the ceremony. That got both their attention. My mother frowned. "A general?" "He saw Grandpa's ring," I said, "the one I wore." My father leaned back slightly, and he recognized it. No one spoke. I opened the box slowly and took out the first ring, setting it on the table. Then I placed the second one beside it. My mother stared. There were two. "Yes." "Why didn't he ever show us these?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Maybe because no one ever stayed still long enough to ask him anything that mattered. She blinked at that hurt crossing her face. I didn't enjoy that, but I didn't take it back. My father picked up the first ring, carefully turning it in his fingers. "So what did this general say?" I folded my hands. "He said Grandpa was part of something that doesn't officially exist. He said he worked alongside SEAL teams, but not in anything you'd find in public records." My mother let out a small breath. "That can't be right." "It is." "How would you know?" my father asked. "Because the general knew his name." That landed. I could see it in the way my father's shoulders shifted, in the way my mother's eyes dropped to the table. "He said other men owed Grandpa their lives," I continued. "He said Grandpa was known for precision and silence, that he went into situations other people wouldn't touch and made sure others came home." The waitress returned with our coffee refill and took one look at our faces before backing off without asking. When she was gone, my mother said quietly, "He never told us any of that." "No," I said, "he didn't." My father set the ring down. "Then, how were we supposed to know?" I leaned forward. "You weren't supposed to know everything I said, but you were supposed to know he mattered." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," I asked. "He was alone at the end, Dad." My mother looked away. I kept going because now that the truth had started moving, I couldn't stop it. He died in that little house with almost no one checking on him. I buried him by myself. There were empty chairs where his own family should have been. And now I'm sitting here finding out that men at the highest levels of the military still remember him with respect. My voice never got loud. That made it hit harder. "You didn't have to know the details of his service," I said. "You just had to show up." My father stared at the table, not me. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then my mother spoke, her voice thinner than usual. "He made it hard." I looked at her. "In what way?" He shut down, she said, after your grandmother died especially. But even before that, you'd ask a question and he'd give you half an answer. You'd try to help and he'd say he didn't need it. You'd invite him over and sometimes he wouldn't come. I let her speak. It felt like he had already decided we weren't close, she said. After a while, she swallowed. After a while, it was easier to stop trying. I believed that she believed it. That didn't make it right. Do you hear yourself? I asked gently. You're describing a man who was damaged, private, proud, and aging, not a man who deserved to be abandoned. That one hit my father. He lifted his head sharply, and I saw it in his face before he spoke. We didn't abandon him, he said. I held his gaze. You missed his funeral. That ended the argument before it could begin. My father exhaled through his nose and leaned back. Not angry now, just tired. I told myself I'd visit the next week, he said after a while. Then something came up. Then another week passed. Then more time. It got harder to explain. There it was. The truth people actually lived with. Not cruelty exactly, just neglect dressed up as postponement. My mother dabbed at one eye with a napkin. I kept meaning to call more. I nodded once, I know. And I did know. That was the worst part. Most family failures didn't come from one monstrous act. They came from 1,000 smaller omissions. I reached into the box and took out the letter. I didn't hand it to them. I just held it. He left this with the rings, I said. He wrote that some things were better carried quietly, that if someone recognized the ring, I should listen, and that I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not even family. My father looked at the letter like it might accuse him by name. Did he mean us, he asked. Yes, I said. No one disputed it. Outside the diner window, a truck rumbled past. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered. Life kept moving the way it always did, even when yours had stopped at one hard truth. My mother looked at the rings again. So he really was. She couldn't quite finish it. A lot more than any of us knew, I said. My father nodded slowly, almost to himself, and he took it all to the grave. I thought about that. Then I shook my head. No, I said. He left enough for someone willing to carry it. That was the first moment either of them looked at me differently that day, not like a daughter talking back, not like the youngest person at the table, like someone standing in the gap they had left open. My coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. For the first time since the funeral, I could feel their guilt settling in, not performative, not dramatic, just real, heavy, late. And late or not, it was a beginning. We didn't say goodbye in the diner so much as we ran out of things we could say without breaking something further. My father paid the bill. My mother hugged me at the door a little tighter than usual, like she wasn't sure when she'd get another chance to do it right. I nodded to my father, and he nodded back. No promises. Just an understanding that something had shifted. Outside, the sky had turned that soft gray you get before rain. I stood by my car for a moment, letting the air settle around me. Late, I said quietly, but not nothing. They came to the house 2 days later. My grandfather's place. I had driven out early that morning, unlocked the door, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. It didn't change the smell, much old wood and coffee and thyme, but it softened the edges. I set the wooden box on the kitchen table next to 3 chairs. When I heard their car pull into the gravel driveway, I didn't rush out to meet them. I stayed where I was. Let them come in. The door opened slowly. Hello, my mother called, her voice uncertain, in a way I hadn't heard since I was a kid. In the kitchen, I answered. They stepped inside like they were entering a place that didn't belong to them anymore. My father paused just past the doorway, looking around as if he expected everything to be different. It wasn't. That was the point. He kept it the same, my father said quietly. He always did, I replied. We stood there for a second, the 3 of us, with all the years between us and all the things we hadn't said yet. Then I pulled out the chairs. Sit, I said. They did. I opened the box and took out the rings first, placing them side by side on the table. My mother watched them like they might move on their own. That's the one you wore, she asked. I nodded. And the other, my father asked. He left it wrapped in the box, I said, with the letter. I handed the letter to my father this time. He hesitated before taking it, like he understood that whatever was written there might not be easy to carry. Read it out loud, I said. He looked up at me surprised. Why? Because he didn't say things out loud when he had the chance, I said. We're not making that mistake again. My father studied my face for a moment, then unfolded the paper. His voice was steady at first. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain things the right way. By the second paragraph, it wasn't as steady. My mother covered her mouth with her hand as he read the line about carrying things quietly. When he reached the end, "You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family," he stopped and stared at the page for a long time. Then he folded it back up carefully like it might fall apart if he rushed. He knew my mother whispered. Knew what I asked. That we didn't understand him, she said. That we never really tried. I didn't answer. Some things don't need help landing. We walked through the house together after that. It wasn't a tour, more like a reckoning. The garage first. My father ran his hand along the workbench, tracing the grooves worn into the wood from years of use. Tools hung in neat rows, each one in its place. He taught me how to change a tire here, my father said almost to himself. I forgot about that. You didn't forget, I said. You just stopped thinking about it. He didn't argue. My mother stood by the old radio, touching the dial gently. He used to listen to this every morning, she said. Same station, same time. You used to complain about it, my father added. She gave a small, sad smile. I remember. We moved into the living room. The chair by the window sat exactly where it always had, angled just enough to catch the afternoon light. A book lay on the side table, a bookmark still tucked between the pages. My mother picked it up, her fingers brushing the edge. He never finished this, she said. No, I replied. He didn't get the chance. The words settled over us like dust. Back in the kitchen, I set the rings down again. This is what the general said, I told them. The first ring shows he belonged. The second shows he mattered. My father nodded slowly. We treated him like he didn't belong anywhere. And like he didn't matter, my mother added, her voice breaking. I didn't soften it. That's true, I said. They didn't push back this time. They sat with it. We drove to the cemetery together that afternoon. Same road, same quiet turn past the trees, same modest gate. But this time there were 3 of us. We walked up to the grave in silence. The ground had settled a little since I'd been there last. The temporary marker stood firm, his name carved clean and simple. My mother stepped forward first. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have come. My father stood beside her, hands clasped in front of him. I thought I had more time, he said. I kept putting it off. I won't do that again. He looked down at the ground, then at the name. You deserved better from me. I stayed a step back, letting them have that moment. It wasn't mine to take, but it was mine to witness. After a while, I stepped forward and placed the first ring on the top edge of the marker just for a second. Then I picked it back up and slipped it onto my finger. I'm keeping this, I said. Not because it's valuable, because it's his. I held up the second ring, turning it once in the light. And this, I added, I'll carry until I understand what to do with it. My father nodded. You will. Not if. Will. That mattered. We stood there a little longer. No speeches this time, no formal words. Just presence. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase what had already happened. But it changed what came next. A small thing. But real. And when we pulled into the driveway, my father didn't go straight inside. He stood there for a moment, looking at the house like he was seeing it and the man who had lived in it for the first time in years. Wish I'd asked more questions, he said quietly. I looked at him. You still can, I said. He frowned. How? I tapped my chest lightly. By the way you live now. He held my gaze for a second, then nodded. Not fully understanding yet, but trying. That night after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table again. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I placed the second ring back in the box, then closed it gently. For now, I said, some things take time. And for the first time, time didn't feel like something we had wasted. It felt like something we might still use well. The house felt different after they left. Not louder, not brighter. Just settled. Like something that had been out of place for a long time had finally been put back where it belonged. I stayed at my grandfather's kitchen table that night longer than I needed to. The same table where he used to sit with his coffee, looking out the window like he had nowhere else to be. I set the wooden box in front of me and opened it one more time. The second ring rested inside quiet and patient. For now, I said again, though this time it felt less like uncertainty and more like respect. Some things weren't meant to be rushed. The next morning I woke up earlier than I had in weeks. Old habits, military life doesn't let go of those easily. I made coffee the way he used to, strong, simple, no shortcuts. I even used his old mug, the one with the chipped handle he never bothered to replace. I sat by the window. Same chair, same view. Different understanding. You didn't need anyone to see it, I said quietly. You just needed to know. That was the part I hadn't fully grasped before. All those years I had thought he was small because he lived small. But he hadn't. He had lived deliberately. There's a difference. I drove back to base later that afternoon. Life didn't pause just because you finally understood something important. Orders still came in, schedules still filled up, responsibilities still waited. But I carried something new with me. Not just the rings. Perspective. A few days later, I received a short message through official channels. No details. Just a time, a location, and a name I recognized. The general. I stood outside his office again, but this time I didn't hesitate before knocking. Enter. Same voice, same calm authority. But I felt different walking in. More grounded. More certain. He looked up as I stepped inside. At ease, he said, then studied me for a moment. You've been thinking. Yes, sir. Good. He gestured toward the chair this time. Sit. I did. He rested his hands on the desk. I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to make sure you understood what you've been given. I nodded. I think I'm starting to. That's enough, he said. Understanding doesn't come all at once. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small folder, sliding it across the desk. What's this? I asked. Nothing classified, he said. Just acknowledgement. I opened it carefully. Inside were a few documents, old, official, redacted in places. But not all. There was my grandfather's name. There were dates, operations, and one line that stood out more than anything else. Commended for actions above and beyond standard operational expectations. Individual declined formal recognition. I felt my throat tighten. He turned it down, I asked. The general nodded, every time. Why? The general leaned back slightly. Because for some men, the work is the point, not the credit. I closed the folder gently. That sounded exactly like him. I also wanted to tell you something else, the general said. I looked up. Men like your grandfather don't just disappear, he said. They leave an impression. On people, on decisions, on outcomes you'll never fully see. I listened. You're part of that now, he added. I frowned slightly. Because of the rings. Because of what you choose to do with what you know he corrected. That stayed with me. When I left his office, I didn't go straight back to my quarters. I walked. Across the base, past the training fields, past the buildings I had passed 100 times before without really looking at them. Everything felt the same. But I didn't. That evening I called my parents again. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. My mother answered this time. Hi, she said, a little unsure. Hey. A pause. Then your father's here. I figured. He picked up on the other line. Hey, he said. We weren't fixed. But we were trying. I met with the general again, I told them. And my father asked. He gave me some documents, I said. About Grandpa, not everything, but enough. My mother's voice came through softly. Was he what you said? Yes. Silence. Then my father spoke. I've been thinking about him a lot this week. Me too, I said. I keep remembering little things, he continued. Stuff I didn't think mattered at the time. It all matters, I said. I know that now. We talked a little longer. Not about everything, but about enough. It wasn't dramatic. No big apologies, no sudden breakthroughs. Just steady, honest conversation. The kind we should have been having years ago. After we hung up, I stepped outside again. The sky was clear this time, stars visible above the quiet spread of the base. I slipped the first ring onto my finger and held the second one in my hand. I think I get it now, I said softly. Not everything, but enough. A week later, I drove back to the cemetery. Alone again. But not the same kind of alone. I stood in front of the grave, the grass now beginning to grow in around the edges. I told them, I said, not everything, just enough. The wind moved gently through the trees. They came back, I added. They said what they needed to say. I paused. They're trying. That felt important. I looked down at the name carved into the stone. You didn't ask for any of this, I said, but you left it anyway. I took a breath. I'll carry it the right way. Not loudly. Not for attention. Just right. Before I left, I placed my hand on the top of the marker for a moment. Then I turned and walked back to my car. No hesitation this time. No looking back. Because some things don't need to be revisited over and over to be honored. They need to be lived forward. If you've made it this far, maybe there's someone in your life you haven't fully seen yet. Someone quiet. Someone easy to overlook. Someone you keep meaning to call or visit or understand, but haven't. Don't wait. Time doesn't always give second chances, and not every story gets told out loud. Some are carried in silence. Some are passed down in small, unnoticed ways. Until someone chooses to pay attention. If this story made you think of someone, reach out to them. If it reminded you of something you've been putting off, don't put it off again. And if you believe stories like this matter, quiet ones, real ones, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. I started this alone. But I don't have to carry it that way anymore. Couldn't afford a lawyer. My father's voice carried across the courtroom loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people sitting behind him chuckled under their breath. I kept walking. The heels of my navy dress shoes clicked softly against the old tile floor inside the Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tightly against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back in his chair wearing the same smug expression I'd seen my whole life whenever he thought he had the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms beside him and smiled thinly. "This'll be quick," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it, but I did. Their attorney, a heavyset man named Richard Bellamy, adjusted his expensive tie and glanced at me with open pity, or maybe contempt. Hard to tell sometimes. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom a moment later and everyone rose. I stood straight automatically. 20 years in the Navy trains certain habits into your bones. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the probate file involving my grandmother Linda Carter's estate. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The whole room smelled faintly like old paper and wet coats. Mr. Bellamy stood first. "Your Honor, this is a very simple matter involving property transfer and estate clarification." Then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a sealed manila envelope. The judge immediately recognized her. "So good to see you again, Ms. Holloway," he said carefully. Richard Bellamy's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret Holloway walked toward the bench with slow, steady steps that somehow made the entire room quieter. I saw my father frown. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. Margaret handed the envelope to the judge. "Direct instructions from Linda Carter," she said calmly. "To be opened only if her granddaughter appeared in court without representation." The judge broke the seal. He read the first page silently. Then he stopped. Actually stopped breathing for a second. Mr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Your Honor." The judge handed him the document. Bellamy's face drained of color so fast it honestly frightened me. "Oh my God," he whispered. My father leaned forward. "What?" Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom of the page like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God, look at that signature." Dad's knees buckled against the wooden chair. "Linda?" And that was the moment my family realized Grandma hadn't left this world nearly as helpless as they believed. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina, while cold February wind blew through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. Waste of money, she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple. Just the way she wanted. I wore my Navy dress whites because I'd flown in directly from Norfolk Naval Station after my leave request was finally approved. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad barely even looked at me. He just nodded toward my uniform. "You still doing all that Navy stuff?" All that Navy stuff. 20 years of service reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. But somehow it still hurt. Inside the church fellowship hall after the burial, people gathered around folding tables, eating casseroles and banana pudding, while soft country gospel music played from an old speaker near the kitchen. My mother spent most of the afternoon discussing Grandma's property. Not grieving. Not remembering. Just discussing assets. The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare, she complained while stirring sweet tea. Dad nodded. We'll probably sell the farmhouse fast as possible. I looked up sharply. Dad gave me a confused look like I'd spoken out of turn. Well, obviously. I stared at him for several seconds. Grandma Linda's farmhouse sat on 12 acres outside town. It wasn't some giant fortune, but the place mattered to her. That porch. Those gardens. The old oak tree out front where she used to sit every evening reading mystery novels while drinking coffee. That house held her whole life. You already decided to sell it? I asked quietly. Mom sighed dramatically. Emily, honey, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here. Never here. I heard that phrase most of my adult life. Never here for birthdays. Never here for Christmas. Never here when Dad had surgery. Never here when the roof leaked. As if military service was some selfish vacation I'd chosen to avoid them. My older brother Mark avoided eye contact completely while shoving deviled eggs onto a paper plate. That was Mark's specialty. Avoiding things. Especially conflict. Especially when our parents were wrong. Dad lowered his voice. Besides, your grandmother depended on us those last few years. I nearly laughed. Depended on them. I was the one calling her every Sunday from whatever base or deployment zone I happened to be stationed in. I was the one paying for the new water heater 2 winters ago after Grandma quietly admitted she couldn't afford it. I was the one she trusted enough to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. My parents visited Linda when it benefited them. I visited because I loved her. That night after everyone left, I drove alone to the small roadside motel outside town where I always stayed during visits home. The same faded sign buzzed outside. The same floral bedspread. The same smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke buried deep in the walls despite years of no-smoking policies. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing part of my uniform. That's when I opened Grandma's final letter. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still unmistakably hers. Emily, if you're reading this, I'm probably somewhere arguing with St. Peter about his coffee. Now listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anybody rewrite your life and convince you otherwise. I had to stop reading for a minute after that, because no one had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Not in 38 years. Outside rain tapped softly against the motel window. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 19 again. Standing in our kitchen with Navy recruitment papers in my hand while Dad shouted that military women ended up lonely and bitter. Mom cried because she thought I'd never get married. Mark sat there silently eating mashed potatoes. Only Grandma Linda smiled. She drove me to the recruiter's office herself the next morning in her old Buick. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail, I asked. She squeezed my hand. Then fail bravely. I still remembered those words 20 years later. The next morning after the funeral, Dad called me before sunrise. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about Grandma. He called about court. Apparently, Linda's estate documents had complications. And somehow those complications were serious enough to involve probate litigation. You probably ought to get yourself a lawyer, Dad said casually. I looked out the motel window toward the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Then he answered carefully. Well, because your grandmother left some confusing paperwork. That was the first moment I realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And somehow, Grandma had known it was coming. I didn't sleep much after my father's phone call. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the motel window, while 18-wheelers rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and walked to the small coffee machine near the motel office. The coffee tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have laughed at that. Bad coffee builds character, she always said. I sat alone in the dim lobby, holding the paper cup with both hands while trying to make sense of everything. Probate litigation. Confusing paperwork. Get yourself a lawyer. None of it sounded right. Grandma Linda had been organized her entire life. The woman labeled extension cords in her garage. She kept appliance warranties from the 1980s in neat folders. There was no universe where she accidentally created legal confusion, which meant one thing. Whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon I drove out to Linda's farmhouse. The gravel road looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had stripped most of the trees bare, and the old white farmhouse sat beneath gray Carolina skies like something quietly waiting to be forgotten. Dad's truck already sat parked outside. So did Mom's SUV. I stayed in my car for a moment watching them through the windshield. My father stood near the barn talking with a realtor. Already. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me hardened a little then. Not anger exactly. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad looked annoyed the second he saw me. "What are you doing here?" I stared at him. "It's Grandma's house." He crossed his arms. "Not for long." The realtor awkwardly pretended to examine the property line, while my mother emerged from the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with Linda's things. Family photographs, cookbooks, old letters. My chest tightened immediately. "Mom," I said carefully, "what are you doing?" "Cleaning." "She just died." Mom sighed dramatically like I was being difficult on purpose. "Emily, this isn't a movie. Real life keeps moving." Real life. Another phrase people use when they want permission to behave badly. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit me first. Coffee. Lavender. Old wood. Grandma. Everything looked exactly the same. Her knitted blanket still draped across the couch. Reading glasses sat beside the recliner near the lamp. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. For one impossible second, it felt like she might walk in from the garden any minute asking whether I wanted pie. Then reality settled back in, and the silence hurt worse than I expected. I slowly walked toward the hallway when my father's voice followed behind me. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end." I turned around. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dad rubbed his jaw. "She got confused sometimes." That was a lie, and we both knew it. Linda Carter was sharper at 82 than most people were at 50. 3 months earlier, she'd beaten me at poker while explaining why the Navy overpaid defense contractors. Confused people don't do that. Mom placed the cardboard box on the table. There were papers everywhere, she added carefully. Legal papers, notes, financial stuff. "What kind of papers?" Dad answered too quickly. "Nothing important." That's when I knew. They were hiding something. That evening after they finally left, I stayed alone at the farmhouse. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my apartment back in Norfolk. This quiet had memory inside it. I wandered slowly through each room, touching familiar things. The hallway wall still displayed my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Not Mark's high school football picture. Not Dad's business award. Mine. Grandma always kept mine in the center. I smiled faintly at that. Then I noticed something strange. One picture frame near the hallway looked crooked. Grandma hated crooked frames. I lifted it carefully. Behind it sat a small sealed envelope taped to the wall. My heart started pounding immediately. Across the front in Linda's shaky handwriting were 5 words. "For Emily, if necessary." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was another letter. Short. Direct. Exactly like her. "Sweetheart, if your parents challenge my wishes, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust nobody else. The number is attached. And Emily, I know exactly what I'm doing. Love always, Grandma." Attached beneath the note was a business card. Margaret Holloway, Esquire. Washington, D.C. Military Estate and Federal Council. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I laughed softly to myself. Of course. Of course Grandma had planned ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest years of my Navy career. My marriage had collapsed after endless deployments and distance. My ex-husband finally admitted he was tired of living with the Navy version of me. I remember calling Grandma from overseas one night after signing divorce papers. I cried harder than I intended. Not because I lost the marriage, but because I felt like I'd failed at being normal. Failed at being a woman somehow. Grandma listened quietly for nearly an hour. Then she said something I never forgot. "Emily, there's nothing wrong with women who survive differently." A week later, care packages started arriving from home. Cookies, coffee, handwritten jokes, new socks, and one legal packet containing financial documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a note. "Margaret helped organize this. She's smarter than most senators." That was Linda. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning I finally called the number. A calm older woman answered on the second ring. "Margaret Holloway speaking." "This is Emily Carter," I said nervously. "Linda Carter's granddaughter." Silence. Then her voice softened instantly. "Oh, sweetheart." Just those 2 words nearly broke me. "She told me you might call," Margaret continued gently. "You knew Grandma." Knew her, honey. Your grandmother saved my career in 1978. That surprised me enough to laugh. What? Margaret chuckled softly. We worked together at a military law office in D.C. long before you were born. Linda was the smartest legal secretary I ever met. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly pieces started connecting. The organized paperwork. The hidden letters. The confidence. She planned this, didn't she? I whispered. Margaret paused carefully. Your grandmother understood people better than they understood themselves. That sounded exactly like Linda. Margaret continued. Emily, your grandmother was deeply concerned before she passed. Concerned about what? Your parents. The room fell silent around me. Outside the farmhouse window, wind moved through the dead winter grass. She believed they intended to pressure the estate process after her death, Margaret explained calmly. So she prepared documentation in advance. I closed my eyes. Even now, even dying, Grandma was still protecting me. Margaret spoke again. Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday? That's the hearing date. I know. There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach tighten. Bring no attorney. What? Trust me. I stared out toward Grandma's garden. Dead roses bent beneath cold February wind. Okay, I whispered finally. Margaret's voice softened again. Your grandmother loved you very much, Emily. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling afraid. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror, buttoning my navy dress uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms seem to arrive exactly when life turns heavy. I stared at my reflection for a long moment. 38 years old. Commander's pin on my collar. 20 years of service. 2 deployments in the Persian Gulf. A Navy Achievement Medal. A divorce. No children. No real place that ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel 12 years old again. I picked up Grandma Linda's letter from the sink counter and folded it carefully into my inside coat pocket. Then I drove to court alone. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance beneath a black umbrella while their attorney smoked beside the sidewalk. My older brother Mark lingered nearby with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. The second Dad saw me, his mouth tightened. You really came without counsel. I locked my car quietly. That seems to bother you. Dad scoffed. It concerns me. No, it didn't. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked situations he could control. Predictable things. Weak people. And today, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely sure what I knew. Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice. Emily, there's still time to handle this privately. I looked at her carefully. Privately, Dad answered before she could. Your grandmother was confused near the end. We don't want the court wasting time over paperwork mistakes. There it was again. Confused. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Grandma deserved better than a screaming match in a courthouse parking lot. So I simply asked, what exactly are you afraid the judge might see? Dad's face hardened immediately. Don't start acting dramatic. Mark still said nothing. He just stared at the wet pavement like a man hoping the earth might open beneath him. We walked inside together in silence. Probate courtroom B felt too small for the amount of tension sitting inside it. Old wooden pews lined the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a copier machine clicked endlessly through courthouse walls. A few local townspeople sat quietly in the back rows. Small-town gossip travels fast, especially when family money's involved. Richard Bellamy stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, organizing stacks of paperwork. He smiled politely at me, though the expression never reached his eyes. Commander Carter, he said. Still no attorney? No, sir. His smile widened slightly. Well, that's certainly your choice. Translation. You're about to lose badly. I took my seat without answering. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a second, I remembered being 16 years old, sitting at our dinner table after telling my parents I wanted to apply for an ROTC scholarship. Dad laughed outright. A girl from this family joining the military. Mom shook her head sadly. You're too emotional for that kind of life. Funny thing about people who underestimate you. Eventually they start believing their own version of reality. Judge Bennett entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The hearing began quickly. Bellamy moved first. Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Linda Carter, deceased, specifically several irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer. He spoke smoothly, professionally, like a man fully convinced victory was routine. He presented my parents as devoted caregivers, responsible, self-sacrificing. He described me as largely absent from family affairs due to military obligations. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. Absent, as though serving your country erased your place in your own family. Bellamy continued. The plaintiffs believe Ms. Carter may have exercised undue emotional influence over the deceased during periods of isolation. That finally made me look up sharply. Undue emotional influence? I almost laughed. Grandma Linda was the strongest-minded woman I'd ever known. Nobody manipulated her. Nobody. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. Commander Carter, he said calmly, do you intend to respond? Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly and said exactly what Margaret instructed me to say. I was advised to wait, Your Honor. Confusion flickered across Bellamy's face. Dad frowned. The judge looked mildly irritated. Wait for what? Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Again. Margaret Holloway entered wearing a dark navy coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even at her age, she moved with remarkable confidence. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. Bellamy's posture changed first, then the judge's expression, then everyone else's. Judge Bennett actually stood halfway from his chair. Ms. Holloway. Margaret nodded politely. Your Honor. Bellamy looked stunned. You're representing Commander Carter. Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses calmly. Number. Bellamy blinked. No. I'm here representing the documented final directives of Linda Carter. Silence settled across the courtroom. Real silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of every tiny sound in the room. Rain against windows. Paper shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back row. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. Your Honor, she said, Linda Carter prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of precisely this situation. Dad's face lost color immediately. How he whispered. Margaret ignored him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages silently, then slower, then very slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Richard Bellamy shifted uneasily beside the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, he asked carefully. The judge handed him the file. Bellamy scanned the documents. I watched the exact moment panic entered his eyes. His face drained completely. Oh my God, he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. What is it? Bellamy kept reading. There were notarized property transfers, medical evaluations confirming Linda's mental competency, recorded financial statements, and handwritten testimony documenting repeated pressure attempts made by my parents during Linda's final year. But that wasn't the part that shattered the room. The final page did that. Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process what he was seeing. Oh my God, he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at my father. You told me Linda Carter handled this paperwork herself. Dad swallowed hard. She did. Bellamy's voice dropped. No, sir, she absolutely did not. Mom gripped the edge of the table. What does that mean? Bellamy turned the final page toward them. At the bottom sat the signature that changed everything. Margaret Holloway, former Federal Military Counsel, former advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast. Dad's knees literally buckled against his chair. Linda, he whispered weakly. And suddenly I understood. Grandma hadn't just prepared paperwork. She had built a shield around me years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Based on these filings, he said carefully, the court recognizes full legal transfer authority previously granted to Commander Emily Carter. The room stayed completely still. Then the judge added the sentence that finally broke my parents completely. And furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting possible coercion attempts against the deceased. Mom burst into tears instantly. Dad turned toward Bellamy in panic. You said this was routine. Bellamy stared at him coldly now. Sir, you failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my entire life. My father looked afraid of me. Not angry. Not disappointed. Afraid. And honestly, that hurt more than I expected it would. The hearing ended less than 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of lies, assumptions, and quiet family manipulation. People always imagine courtroom victories as dramatic celebrations, music swelling, heroes walking confidently into sunlight. Real life doesn't feel like that. Real life feels exhausting. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and gray over downtown Norfolk. Reporters weren't waiting. No applause echoed through the streets. Just cold wind, traffic, and the strange emptiness that comes after emotional shock. Margaret Holloway walked beside me quietly, carrying her leather briefcase. "You handled yourself well," she said. I gave a tired laugh. I barely spoke. That's usually wiser in court. We stopped near the courthouse steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at her. "How long did Grandma plan this?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Longer than you realize." I shook my head slowly. She knew they'd challenge everything. She hoped they wouldn't, Margaret answered gently. But Linda understood human nature very well. That sounded exactly right. Grandma trusted carefully, loved deeply, and prepared thoroughly. Margaret adjusted her coat against the wind. She worried less about the property, she admitted, and more about what your parents might do to you emotionally once she was gone. That sentence hit harder than the court ruling itself, because it was true. This was never only about land, or money, or a farmhouse. It was about power, who mattered, who didn't, who spent years being treated like an outsider inside their own family. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone already contained 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Mark. I ignored all of them. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply couldn't handle another conversation yet. Instead, I drove back to Linda's farmhouse. The farther I got from Norfolk, the quieter my thoughts became. Rainwater still clung to the fields along the highway. Bare trees blurred past my windows, while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. At some point during the drive, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because court had confirmed something I spent most of my life trying not to admit. My parents never truly understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. The farmhouse looked softer in the late afternoon light. I parked beside the porch and sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The house greeted me with silence again. But not empty silence, comfortable silence. Linda's kind of silence. I made coffee automatically using the old machine she'd owned since I was in high school. The thing sounded like a lawnmower every time it brewed. Grandma refused to replace it. Suffering builds appreciation, she used to joke. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in her recliner. That's when the memories started arriving harder than before. Birthdays missed during deployment. Christmas video calls from military bases overseas. Promotions my parents barely acknowledged. The time Dad told neighbors Mark was the one who stayed loyal to the family, as if service members abandoned people by serving elsewhere. I stared at the family photographs lining the shelf. Most included Mark. His baseball trophies, his wedding, his children. Normal milestones. Traditional milestones, the kind my parents understood. Then there was me, always in uniform, always leaving again, always slightly outside the picture even when standing inside it. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier. I had just returned from deployment overseas. Grandma and I sat together on this very porch drinking coffee while summer cicadas screamed through the trees. "You know what your problem is?" she asked me. I smiled. "Only one. You spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who already decided not to understand you." That memory nearly broke me now, because she was right. She had always been right. Around 7 o'clock, headlights appeared outside. I looked through the curtains and saw Mark climbing slowly out of his truck. Of everyone in the family, Mark looked the worst after court. Not angry, not defeated, ashamed. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He shoved his hands awkwardly into his pockets. Hey. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Mark walked through the farmhouse slowly, like someone entering a church after years away. We sat at the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve pancakes every Sunday morning. For several minutes he said nothing. Finally he looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I already knew what he meant. But I let him say it anyway. "They treated you differently your whole life." I stared down at my coffee. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew it, Em." That nickname hurt unexpectedly. He hadn't called me that in years. He swallowed hard. I didn't want to fight with Dad. There it was. The truth. Simple. Ugly. Human. I nodded slowly. "You depended on him." "Yeah, you still do." Mark looked embarrassed. "Probably." Silence settled between us again. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy? What? Grandma always talked about you like you were the brave one. I almost smiled. She exaggerated. No, Mark said quietly, she didn't. That hit me harder than I expected. Because Mark had spent most of our lives staying neutral, safe, watching conflict from the sidelines. Hearing him say that now mattered. Later that night, after Mark left, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was my mother, alone. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, while cold wind moved through the dark yard behind her. For a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired, too. I opened the door without speaking. Mom stepped inside carefully. I won't stay long. I nodded toward the kitchen. She sat down slowly at the table but didn't remove her coat. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally she whispered, "She always admired you." I looked up. "Grandma." Mom nodded. "She used to talk about you constantly." Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Mom stared down at her hands. "She admired your independence." I waited quietly. Then Mom said the sentence I never expected to hear from her. "You became everything I never had the courage to be." The room went completely still. Outside wind rattled softly against the farmhouse windows. I stared at my mother while years of resentment, confusion, and sadness shifted uneasily inside me. And for the first time in my life, I realized she might have been afraid too. My mother stayed at the farmhouse less than 20 minutes that night. Long enough to say things neither of us fully knew how to handle. Not long enough to fix 38 years of distance. Before leaving, she paused beside the front door with her hand resting on the knob. "I know your father went too far," she said quietly. I folded my arms. "You went along with it." She nodded once. "No excuses." Honestly, that surprised me more than denial would have. Mom looked around the farmhouse slowly. "She loved this place." "I know. She wanted you here." My throat tightened slightly. Then Mom said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. "You know, when you joined the Navy, your father thought you were rejecting us." I frowned. "I joined because I needed my own life. I know that now. But back then they didn't. Or maybe they couldn't." Some parents confuse independence with abandonment, especially when their children grow into people they no longer control. After she left, I locked the front door and walked quietly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The farmhouse creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Every corner held memory. Grandma teaching me how to make biscuits in the kitchen. Grandma showing me constellations from the backyard during humid Carolina summers. Grandma driving me to the recruiter's office while Dad refused to speak to me. She had been the bridge between me and the rest of the family for years, and now she was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table around midnight holding the final sealed letter Margaret had given me after court. "Linda wanted you to read this only after the hearing," she'd said. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled more than I expected. Inside were 4 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The first line alone nearly broke me. "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen." I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she knew me well enough to understand I'd need a minute before continuing. I kept reading. "First things first. The house, the land, and the savings are not your burden. They are not payment for suffering. And they are certainly not rewards for pain. I left them to you because you understand responsibility better than the rest of this family." Tears blurred the page for a moment. I wiped them away carefully. "You spent your whole life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. That was never true. The right people love you because you are you." I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse. Everything felt very still, very far away. Then I reached the final page. And that was the page that changed me. "Emily, do not become hard simply because others were hard to you. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I have seen too much of it already. If this family breaks apart after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. You are stronger than anger. Always remember that." I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. Long enough for dawn to begin lightening the windows. And somewhere during those quiet early morning hours, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but exhaustion. I was tired of carrying anger everywhere. Tired of proving my worth. Tired of needing my parents to become different people before I allowed myself peace. 3 days later, I met Margaret Holloway for lunch near the waterfront in Norfolk. The restaurant overlooked gray winter water where small boats rocked gently against the docks. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. "Your grandmother loved this place," she said while unfolding her napkin. I smiled faintly. She loved everywhere with decent pie. Margaret laughed softly. That too. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The Navy. Travel. Old stories about Linda during her years working in military law offices. Apparently my grandmother once embarrassed a Pentagon attorney by correcting his paperwork in front of an entire meeting. That sounded exactly like her. Then Margaret looked at me carefully. What will you do now? I stirred my coffee slowly. I'm not sure yet. You could pursue additional legal action. I know. The coercion evidence alone might have destroyed my parents financially if I pushed harder. Public embarrassment. Civil penalties? Potential fraud investigations. A younger version of me might have wanted that. Or maybe a more wounded version. But sitting there by the harbor listening to gulls outside the restaurant windows, I realized something important. I didn't actually want revenge anymore. Not real revenge. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from constantly reopening old wounds, hoping they'd heal differently. I looked at Margaret. I think Grandma already won. Margaret smiled softly. Yes, she said, I believe she did. Over the next several weeks, I made decisions my family never expected. I sold a small, undeveloped portion of the land near the highway and used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for Navy families in eastern North Carolina. Nothing enormous, just enough to help military kids with tuition or emergency expenses. I named it the Linda Carter Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. Dad called twice, trying to discuss financial fairness. I didn't return the calls. Not out of cruelty. I simply understood something now. Some conversations only reopen damage. I also restored the farmhouse instead of selling it. Slowly, carefully. I repaired the porch steps, repainted the kitchen, planted new roses beside the front walkway where Grandma used to garden every spring. And for the first time in years, I slowed down enough to breathe. Military life teaches you constant movement. Schedules, deadlines, deployment clocks, always preparing for the next thing. But the farmhouse moved differently. Morning coffee on the porch, rain against tin roofing, birds settling into oak trees at dusk. Simple things, human things. One afternoon while planting tomatoes in the backyard garden, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Donahue leaned across the fence watching me work. You know something, she said. What's that? Your grandmother didn't save you with money. I brushed dirt from my hands. No. Mrs. Donahue smiled gently. She saved you with love. I looked out across the property then. The garden. The porch swing. The old oak tree swaying quietly in warm Carolina wind. And suddenly I understood exactly what Grandma had really left me. Not land. Not inheritance. Not victory. Permission. Permission to stop fighting for love that should have been freely given all along. 1 year later, the farmhouse finally felt alive again. Not polished. Not perfect. Alive. The porch had fresh white paint now. New flower boxes hung beneath the front windows, overflowing with yellow daisies and red geraniums. Wind chimes Grandma once loved swayed gently in the warm Carolina breeze. And for the first time in decades, the house sounded happy. Soft conversation drifted through the backyard while folding chairs filled slowly beneath the old oak tree. A few of my Navy friends had driven down from Norfolk for the memorial gathering. Nothing formal. Just food, stories, coffee, and people who loved Linda Carter. I wore jeans and a dark navy jacket instead of dress whites that afternoon. Somehow it felt more honest that way. Less ceremony. More family. Real family. The kind you build through loyalty